This is the story of an empire built on an illusion. In less than 6 years, what was breathlessly sold to the world as the ultimate liberation story has quietly collapsed into a masterclass in commercial desperation. What looked like a triumphant declaration of financial independence was in reality a devastating trap of their own making. In this video, we are going to unpack the terrifying math behind the Montecito facade. We will explore how a staggering $6 million annual operating cost forced a royal prince and a former actress into the punishing grind of lifestyle merchandising. We will examine why the 2026 Crown Estate Audit exposed the brutal truth of their isolation, and what the quiet distancing of Hollywood executives means for the survival of their brand. By the end, you will understand the profound psychological toll of trying to monetize a rebellion that the world has already stopped watching, and the devastating subtle signals that reveal a marriage buckling under the weight of its own ambition. To understand the magnitude of this quiet collapse, you have to remember the sheer scale of their golden era. When they walked away from the British monarchy, they were not just a couple seeking privacy. They were an absolute cultural phenomenon. They held the global attention, economy in the palm of their hands. The initial narrative was intoxicating. They were the brave defectors, leaving behind an archaic institution to build a billion-dollar philanthropic powerhouse on their own terms. They had a massive Spotify contract. They had a highly lucrative agreement with Netflix. They had the immediate, unquestioning support of global power brokers, Silicon Valley billionaires, and the highest tiers of Hollywood royalty. They purchased a sprawling estate in Santa Barbara with a staggering mortgage, assuming that the immense wealth they had always been adjacent to would naturally become their own. The tragedy is that they fundamentally misunderstood the source of their gravity. They believed the public was fascinated by their inherent talent, their unique voices, and their humanitarian vision. But the uncomfortable truth is that the public was fascinated by the crown. The moment the royal stardust began to settle, the harsh, unforgiving reality of corporate Hollywood set in. They were no longer mysterious figures veiled in ancient tradition. They were content creators who had to deliver a return on investment. The pressure points began to show long before the crisis of 2026. The initial millions from explosive television interviews and a deeply personal memoir provided a massive influx of cash, but they were built on a finite resource. You can only sell your family's secrets once. Once the grievances were fully aired, the streaming platforms and corporate partners expected original, compelling content. And that is where the quiet distancing began. Corporate executives, driven purely by profit margins, realized that the Sussex brand was entirely reliant on its proximity to the institution it had publicly disavowed. The Spotify deal dissolved. The Netflix relationship grew increasingly strained, and suddenly the staggering cost of their freedom became impossible to ignore. Maintaining a royal lifestyle without the immense invisible machinery of the sovereign grant is an astronomically expensive endeavor. Private security alone for high-profile targets is estimated at millions of dollars a year. The staff, the travel, the public relations firms, the legal battles, the mortgage on a California mansion. It is a relentless financial machine that requires constant feeding. By the beginning of 2026, it was becoming blindingly obvious that their expenses were ballooning at the exact moment their primary income streams were drying up. What happened next was a fascinating pivot that revealed the depth of the panic. The launch of a lifestyle brand was presented to the public as a passion project, a natural evolution of a curated life. But a closer look at the timing and the execution suggests something much darker. It was a commercial necessity. It was a desperate attempt to create a sustainable revenue stream as the entertainment mega deals faded. The visual humiliation of this transition was profound. Here was a couple who once sat with world leaders at the apex of global diplomacy, now reduced to orchestrating viral social media unboxings for jars of fruit preserves. The contrast of schadenfreude was inescapable. The world watched as a prince of the realm, a man born into the most exclusive club on earth, stood by while his brand was leveraged to sell jam. But the true devastating contrast arrived in the spring of 2026. While the Sussexes were fighting to keep their commercial ventures afloat and managing the optics of unsold inventory, the royal family prepared for a formal Crown Estate audit. The sovereign grant, the very funding the couple had proudly walked away from, in the name of self-sufficiency, was announced at a staggering £137 million. The contrast was brutal and inescapable. In London, the institution they tried to dismantle was thriving, backed by an ancient, untouchable wealth its future secured for generations. In California, the reality was a frantic scramble for relevance and liquidity. The moral contradiction here is staggering. For years, the public narrative was aggressively shaped around their victimhood, framing the monarchy as a toxic environment that they heroically escaped for their own survival. Yet their entire commercial survival in the free market remained tethered to the very titles bestowed upon them by that same toxic environment. They demanded the deference of royalty while operating as commercial influencers. They wanted the impenetrable security of heads of state, but the lack of accountability of private citizens. This is the dark, psychological truth behind their current era. It is not just about a lack of funds, it is about the profound isolation that comes when the world realizes your rebellion was entirely dependent on the oppressor's bank account. They built a gilded cage of their own making, trapped by the exorbitant cost of maintaining the illusion of immense success. Every public appearance, every carefully curated photograph, began to look less like a victory lap and more like a proof of life. The subtle social media signals carried devastating deeper meanings. A carefully timed photo release here, a leaked story about financial independence there. But these were just bandages on a hemorrhage. The pressure inside the marriage under these conditions is unimaginable. Sources began to quietly indicate that the burden of generating income was falling heavily on one side, while the other remained focused on passion projects that brought in prestige but no capital. The financial burden was rapidly becoming a spiritual burden. When you base your entire public identity on being the architects of your own salvation, running out of money is not just a logistical problem. It is a complete collapse of your foundational narrative. But what no one outside the palace walls realized was that the 2026 royal audit was not just a routine financial disclosure. It contained a subtle, calculated bureaucratic maneuver, a deeply buried detail regarding the handling of international royal property leases and the final severing of subsidized security arrangements. It was a quiet, ruthless checkmate from an institution that never complains and never explains, and it left them entirely alone staring down a multi-million-dollar deficit, with a brand that had lost its magic and a family that had finally stopped answering the phone. The silence that followed the 2026 Crown Estate audit was far more damaging than any public statement could ever be. For years, the survival of the Sussex brand relied entirely on a delicate equilibrium, the ability to provoke a response from the institution they had left behind. Every headline, every leaked grievance, and every legal skirmish served as a twisted form of validation, proving that they still mattered to the family and therefore still mattered to the world. But when the palace executed its quiet, bureaucratic maneuver, stripping away the final remaining structural ties under the guise of routine administrative updates, it signaled a terrifying shift. The palace was no longer participating in the conflict. They had simply closed the ledger. Inside the iron gates of their Montecito estate, this administrative finality fundamentally altered the dynamic between the couple. When a rebellion runs out of oxygen, the revolutionaries inevitably turn on each other. The psychological pressure of this era shifted from an external battle against a centuries-old monarchy to an internal struggle for identity and survival. For a prince who had spent his entire life cocooned in an ecosystem where his safety status and material needs were handled by an invisible, omnipotent apparatus, the reality of the open market became an existential shock. On the other side, a self-made woman who prided herself on corporate strategy and media mastery was forced to confront a brutal truth. Her most sophisticated PR plays were no longer yielding a return on investment. The public facade, however, remained aggressively flawless. The release of intimate, behind-the-scenes imagery to celebrate their 8th anniversary was a masterclass in narrative damage control. The world was treated to high-contrast, artfully styled glimpses of domestic bliss, designed to project an image of a couple united against adversity, entirely content in their self-imposed exile. But to seasoned public relations analysts, the sheer effort behind the imagery signaled a profound vulnerability. True security does not require a press release. The hyper-curation of their private life began to look less like a genuine celebration and more like a necessary corporate asset, an attempt to stabilize a brand that was losing its institutional anchor. This contrast between public interpretation and private uncertainty is where the true tragedy of the modern celebrity ecosystem unfolds. In Hollywood, power is an incredibly fluid currency, and its gatekeepers possess hypersensitive radar for declining leverage. In the immediate aftermath of their departure from London, global elite circles embraced them because they represented the ultimate cultural capture, a rogue royal prince and an American actress redefining global influence. But as the multi-million-dollar streaming deals began to stall and The content pivoted from high-minded geopolitical advocacy to lifestyle merchandising. The nature of their alliances shifted. The invitations to exclusive high-level summits were quietly replaced by transactional business arrangements. The high-tier power brokers did not turn on them with hostility. Instead, they did something far worse in the entertainment industry. They became politely indifferent. The deeper meaning behind these subtle shifts is what makes this story a defining text for the modern era. What looked like a simple choice to launch a luxury lifestyle brand was actually a profound de-evolution of status. It exposed the moral contradiction at the heart of their entire enterprise. You cannot successfully market yourself as a transcendent humanitarian leader fighting systemic global inequality while simultaneously relying on a premium lifestyle brand that sells high-priced artisanal goods to the ultra-wealthy. The narrative collapsed under the weight of its own logical inconsistency. The audience, which had once been divided into fierce defenders and vocal critics, began to settle into a state of collective fatigue. The weaponization of victimhood had finally crossed the threshold into commercial exhaustion. This is precisely why this story resonates so deeply with millions of viewers around the world, far beyond the petty details of royal gossip. It is a modern cautionary tale about the illusion of autonomy in the attention economy. It demonstrates that in the hyper-connected wilderness of modern fame, prestige is not a quality that can be detached from its origin, placed in a vacuum, and monetized indefinitely. The very things they sought to escape, the rigid structures, the historical tradition, the absolute lack of commercial transparency, were the exact elements that gave their words value. Without the crown, they were forced to compete on equal terms with every other content creator, influencer, and lifestyle guru in a crowded, unforgiving marketplace. Looking forward, the path for the Sussex brand appears increasingly narrow. They are locked into a relentless cycle of reinvention, where each new venture must be louder, more intimate, and more commercially viable than the last, just to maintain the overhead of their current reality. The choices ahead are no longer about artistic fulfillment or philanthropic impact. They are driven by the cold, hard mathematics of an annual operating deficit. They cannot return to the institution they disavowed, and they cannot fully integrate into the Hollywood ecosystem they attempted to conquer. They remain suspended in a glittering, self-manufactured limbo, watched by millions not for what they will build, but to see how long the illusion can be sustained. The collapse of an empire is rarely a sudden explosive event. It happens in the quiet spaces between the headlines, in the unsold inventory of a lifestyle brand, in the unreturned phone calls of corporate executives, and in the clinical clarity of a bureaucratic audit. It is the slow, agonizing realization that the freedom you sacrificed everything to achieve has become its own immaculate prison. Thank you for watching. If you found this analytical breakdown compelling, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your perspective on the changing nature of public power in the comments below. We will see you in the next deep dive.